Control takes place in the space between perception and reality. There is so much vagary in the way we see the world. So much of what we think we remember is made of half-truths and whole lies. The ambiguity of memory has given rise to so many mysteries, legends, communities, and stories. Is it so mad to think that those coalescences of thought might give rise to greater oddities? That the minds of so many focused onto a single imaginary point couldn't create something fantastic? This dream is the reality of Control, and without further ado, let's peer behind the curtain of Remedy's most surreal title. To say that Control is a return to form for Remedy after Quantum Break is an understatement, as they sprung right back from their worst title to make their best. From the first moment in the game, Control immerses the player in a world beyond comprehension. In the past, Remedy has drawn conservatively from Lovecraftian ideas in their games, and a valid criticism of Lovecraftian fiction is the repetitive lengths it goes to in order to describe the unknowable. Here, Control accomplishes the task of impossible architecture and unknowable entities beyond time much more effectively than written or even visual media by having you experience those things firsthand. Your first moments in the setting of Control, the oldest house, will have you questioning your sanity when you loop back to the beginning of your journey in impossible fashion. While you are wondering how to make your way into the central meeting area with no doors, the world shifted around you, and the entrance you used is gone. Nothing in the oldest house is possible, and yet everything in this shifting monstrosity is real. Every Remedy game in the past started with a character and a familiar set of tropes, and built the game's story and world from there. The player could feel comfortable with the tropes of noir fiction, the writings of King, or the trappings of Back to the Future. But Control stands out by first building the fiction of the oldest house, the Federal Bureau of Control and the board, and then thrusting Jesse Faden in as interloper. It is an alien and hostile world Jessie sought but could scarcely imagine exists. She describes the mundane world in terms of a room with a poster on the wall, where the world is the poster, but every once in a while something reaches out from behind the confines of that poster, teasing something deeper, something grander. But before any insight can be gained, that tendril recedes and the world is mundane once again. This might sound familiar, as it is very evocative of the Platonic metaphor of the cave, or, if you would prefer a more modern example, like the world outside perception of the Matrix. The game draws heavily from this metaphor to explain the nature of the game and the world around Jesse. Before we set about exploring the oldest house and Jesse's plight further, I feel there is a certain elephant in the room we must address. It would be very easy to just dismiss the narrative of Control as a copy and paste from the SCP Wiki, and it does borrow many aspects of that narrative project. For those not in the know, the SCP Wiki is a collaborative storytelling effort structured as an internal database for a shadowy government organization interested in finding and containing supernatural entities and objects. Some of the most well-known of these being SCP-173, an adaptation of Doctor Who's Weeping Angels, SCP-178, 3D glasses that awaken the era to horrific extra-dimensional entities that live beside us, always watching, always benign, and less disturbed by the wearer of the glasses, and SCP-096, aka the Shy Guy who shoots forward like a bullet to kill anyone who sees his face, no matter where they are. The most obvious similarity is the way these objects or entities are described. Control borrows the clinical structure and numerous lines of redacted text used by those creating the SCP documents. In recent attempts to get AI to visually understand the world, we are able to dive into the minds of those intelligences to see what they believe the essence of various items are. These swirling patterns of madness are a rare and impossible glimpse into the mind of another. And while difficult to comprehend, it does beg the question: what is the essence of a thing? What really constitutes an idea like love, loss, danger, or plastic pink flamingos? How could these ideas manifest in the physical world if given the opportunity? Control seeks to answer those questions with its biggest diversion from the SCP project in Altered Items and Objects of Power, as each of these encapsulates a moment, idea, or emotional state of a person or group captured in amber. One of the game's earliest examples is a disk that contains stolen Soviet nuclear launch codes. Those codes absorbed every bit of Cold War anxiety about nukes flying left and right, turned into a floppy disk that can literally launch anything with lethal velocity. Another item that highlights the interest of the creators in modern urban legends is the safe. Following the logic of many a Reddit post, the safe was created when a man posted an image of a safe he inherited online, hoping he would receive advice on how to open it. When he attempted to use explosives to open the safe, it survived entirely undamaged. With this, it was taken into custody, where its nature as an object of power was confirmed, enabling its binder to put up an impenetrable shield constructed from nearby debris. All of this makes only too much sense from the perspective of avid Redditors, sure that these posters will open the safe eventually, and those safes will be filled with all of their wildest desires. Surely the only reason someone wouldn't open one of these mystery boxes is that it was impossible, that they were waylaid by powers beyond the understanding of man, right? Of course, in Control, Redditors aren't the only ones haunted by colors out of space. Within moments of her arrival to the oldest house's dreamscape, Jessie is appointed to the directorship of the Federal Bureau of Control, and is introduced to its board of directors, an inverted black pyramid who dwell in the collective unconscious of the astral plane. The reasons for her taking such an important position are numerous, but they begin with the fact that she is a para-utilitarian, someone capable of controlling objects of power. These objects will naturally allow her to wield numerous paranatural abilities, all the way from flight to mind control. The second and more pressing reason for her appointment is that the board and the bureau are under siege from an entity known only as the Hiss. They are described as a frequency, an invasive sound with the ability to steal away both people and altered items it comes into contact with, and it has consumed almost the entire Federal Bureau of Control. A unique tool Jessie will have at her disposal to dispatch the Hiss is the service weapon. A symbol of her bond to the board and directorship, it takes whatever form its wielder can imagine. In times of old, it took the shape of Mjolnir and Excalibur, but for Jessie, who lives in the now, it appears as a simple firearm. A pistol, a shotgun, a machine pistol, all forms easy for Jessie to grasp, and so it may become. By the end of the game, Jessie will have access to numerous forms of the service weapon, and powerful paranormal abilities that will allow you to effortlessly float around the game's many combat arenas. Granted flight, evasion, telekinesis, and mind control, the game's combat rhythms remind me quite a lot of 2016's Doom. In no small part because killing enemies gains you health to continue to kill enemies and get more health, creating a system that rewards aggression and momentum very similar to that game. The primary emphasis of the combat is that you need to keep moving and shooting, and most importantly, throwing things. The telekinesis provided by the aforementioned floppy disk relatively early on is your primary weapon you will use to fight the Hiss, especially in the late game. The longer the game goes on, the less efficient your service weapon becomes, and the stronger your lock-on telekinetic murder button becomes, until by the post-game, using any of the various forms of the service weapon all feel like spitting in the wind. The sheer ineffectualness of the service weapon is my main complaint with the primary gameplay loops of Control. No matter what form you pick or upgrade you apply, by the mid-game it feels like nothing more than a pea shooter. This forces you to rely on pressing E to pick up debris and repeatedly fling them at your opponents while flying around the environment. While still quite fun, I would have appreciated a bit more balance among the other abilities and weapons, or even simply less tanky enemies so that it feels like your other tools packed a bit more of a punch. Even mind control feels mostly pointless, as it takes quite some time to activate, controlled enemies seem like little more than cannon fodder, and enemies already need to be near death to use this tool. A later upgrade allows you to just utilize throw to pick up low health enemies, killing them and providing you with a powerful weapon in the process. There are an extensive series of upgrade systems allowing you to make your weapons more powerful, increase Jesse's stats, and provide 3 nominal buffs to your other abilities. Like the service weapon, however, most of these upgrades are too small to care much about. For significant portions of the game, I forgot they existed and failed to use them entirely, to find combat functionally no different than when I did remember them later. The pointless upgrade systems reach their zenith with an upgrade store where you can trade some of the game's currency for random boosts. I forgot this both times that I played through Control, and hurt not at all for its absence. All of these systems seem tacked on, for little more reason than to provide small incentives for you to explore your environment, but they feel too inconsequential to act as such a motivator. This hardly stopped me from exploring every nook and cranny of the oldest house, for reasons we'll get to later, making their reliance on those systems to me feel entirely unnecessary. I'm reminded of Alan Wake, where a series of simple systems, all working in concert together, made for a combat system that had much more depth than was obvious at first glance. But Control has many elements that all sound very exciting, and like they should create a system with immeasurable depth, but fail in practice to be much more than using a single ability over and over. Again, this hardly means that Control's gameplay is not fun. Throwing vending machines, forklifts, and concrete ripped from the walls of the building at enemies while flying around is engaging, and later content, especially the Foundation DLC, introduces new enemies that challenge the previously established paradigms, forcing you to at least try and use your other abilities and weapons. It is more apt to say, I think, that Control has much squandered potential. With the opportunity to grant the player unique abilities and fantastical powers, most people will spend 90% of the game utilizing a single paranatural ability and leaving the rest on the table. Control is a branching tree of madness, a web of connections only tenuously held together by its overarching narrative. While not fully open, this is Remedy's most open game to date, and as such, it adopts a structure wherein the player rarely feels pushed to the next main objective, and may instead languish within the structure of the oldest dream. It is these diversions that make Control so worthwhile, and I would be remiss not to explain why that is. First, we must look at the oldest house. For every bit as much as it is staged, it is also actor. When I say the oldest house is a shifting dreamscape, I mean that literally. The house shifts regularly, with rooms and even entire departments moving and disappearing entirely. One of the many memos in the game highlights some of the more mundane hazards of working inside this cave of dreams, as they've been without a toilet for weeks since it disappeared in a recent building shift. I do not use the word dreamscape lightly, as that is absolutely the nature of the oldest house. It is a dream, and junction to dreamers, a place where the barriers between imagined and the real are so thin as to be easily punctured. Ever since Max Payne 2, Remedy has been drawing their creations further from their comfortable home in fiction and closer to their creators, drawing the figments of a dream closer to their dreamers, and here in the oldest house the gap is finally closed. That which before could only be seen by nightly musings is now seen while waking. This could never end well for our figments, for they are dealing with powers that form them, meddling in affairs truly beyond them. Even as they stand at the threshold of a tidal wave, that danger is every bit as tantalizing to them as it is terrifying. And those who believe that they might control the very fundament of the human mind will hardly stop in the face of old God and eldritch foes. The entity that appointed Jesse are one of the house's dreamers, and they can see the world right down to its fundaments. They always address things in multiple ways, what they are and how they are perceived. They often just refer to the nature of control as a video game, as they see it all from the outside. They embody the driving force of the creators, pushing forward Jessie and giving her a goal. The board provide reason for Jessie to be and create the context of her as protagonist. Technology within the oldest house has a deliberate retro form and function. Nothing within the oldest house can be permitted which has not cemented itself within the public consciousness, least of all technology. CRT TVs and monitors were first demonstrated in 1897 and used all the way up to the late 1990s, and even now, fringe communities still rely on their unique capabilities. It is not an overstatement to say that the CRT device is one of the longest-lived pieces of modern technology. However, after the CRT was no longer the norm, technology quickly moved to projection, plasma, LCD, LED, and now OLED, with numerous offshoots and technological orphans left behind. None of these can be said to have the legacy or romantic connection to culture that the CRT did, with no single version of the flat-screen tech lasting more than a few years before being outpaced by a competitor. The same could be said of cell phones. With yearly iteration, constantly changing tech and form factor, there is no possibility for any single one of these devices to take root within the minds of the populace. More than that, the retro tech used in the oldest house has a long history in media. Everything from Alien to Jurassic Park use similar technology, and even though you might understand how to use your phone better than an imaginary Unix system, the Unix system would find a better home inside the oldest house since it has greater mimetic potential. Inside the shifts of the house are not only found minor inconveniences and sometimes death, but portals to what the FBC describes as thresholds. These thresholds are the literal doorsteps of other dimensions and planes, which are usually useful to the FBC, and occasionally they lead to infinite clocks. Traversing this place is unsurprisingly complicated, with many of its segments being blocked off by the need to first travel through one of those thresholds, the Ocean View Motel. There's always been just a little magic in hotel rooms to me. Maybe it's the escape from the mundane. Maybe it's the feeling of stepping into someone else's life. No matter the reason, there is a freedom found in these places. In a hotel, you can feel everywhere and nowhere at once, and that is exactly where the Ocean View Motel is situated. It is a comforting void and homey junction, safe haven and comfy portal to the unknown. I love how it feels to be in the Ocean View, and being there is made only the more thrilling by the way it is traversed. It is some of the best world building and puzzle solving combined into one level I've ever seen. It naturally prods the player into completing the rituals which scale in difficulty over time. The first time you will ever go there, you'll find a bell to interact with. Ringing it once reveals no way out. A second time, no dice. A third time reveals a key you can use to leave, and teaches the player a valuable lesson. Everything here happens in threes. All of this is taught with no tutorials or even indication that a puzzle needed to be solved. Meanwhile, this demonstrates that this is a place defined or maybe even created by rituals. This only naturally prods further questions. Was this made by someone who observed rituals over and over again until the ocean view transcended its original purpose? Was this ever a real place at all? Wisely, none of these questions are ever conclusively answered, and the player is left only to wonder. The oldest house shifts, opens portals to strange and hostile dimensions, is infected with a devouring mold and more mysteries than the Bureau may ever comprehend. So why put up shop here? The oldest house obscures itself from all those who ought not see it, and in time it has bestowed this boon upon the Bureau itself. It is easy to understand how this anonymous brutalist structure can easily blend into its surroundings, as even those who live in a place like New York must pass one building after another with ambiguous purpose and empty faces, never knowing what lies inside. Seen from the sky, each towering structure blends into another, each a tree in a concrete forest no more important or notable than another. No review of Control would be complete without mentioning the Ashtray Maze, and not without good reason. For if there is one thing that really marks Remedy coming back into their own, it is the Ashtray Maze. It's a combination of incredibly over-the-top visual design, only matched by the poets of the fall pumping into your brain as you conduct your rampage through the shifting hallways. The mechanical climax of the game, the visuals are stunning and play incredibly well with player expectations to magnificently raise the energy of the scene to fever heights. It really does nearly bring a tear to my eye to see a set piece designed with this level of mastery. This is simply a team at the top of their game, outputting some of the greatest works in their field. The mirror altered item is maybe the best example of all Control's strengths being utilized in one scene. It starts by leaving numerous notes that teach you about the containment procedures for the mirror and explaining what it does. It projects a mirror version of our world within a limited radius around the mirror, but this mirrored copy isn't exactly the same. Numerous differences have been noted by researchers, and they conclude that the mirror shows us how it wants things in the real world to be. This is an important detail, as the mirror is presently under combination lock that can only be undone by placing several sliding windows in exact sequence. But the mirror wants us to use it. It wants to show us what's inside. And so, in its reflection, we see the combination to this lock. And that is the genius of this item. You have to know, read, and understand the nature of the mirror to get in. You have to take on the role of an altered item researcher and really comprehend what's going on to progress. This is something so infrequently accomplished by games, as the balance between moon logic that will just frustrate the player into giving up, and handing the player the solution out of fear they won't want to engage with the world, are all too often solutions employed by games. Control manages to craft a puzzle at just the right level of logic and engagement, to push but not break the player's will while immersing them further into the world of the game. I must applaud the developers' hard work in the scene, and many like it, as it is simple to have this idea, but as we've seen time and again, nearly impossible to actually pull off. Speaking of logs, almost everyone in Control is worth taking the time to read. Following closely the formula set by Alan Wake, the game's lore-expanding content is split into three major parts: written logs, radio shows, and my personal favorite, cheesy low-budget live-action videos. I'll admit I've really been waiting for someone to this critique just to gush about Threshold Kids. In many respects, Remedy's live-action video opus, this show is made in-universe to teach Jesse's brother Dylan about the FBC and its many hazards and opportunities. Conceived by someone with all of the experience of a weekend college remedial course on puppet making, Threshold Kids masterfully captures the atmosphere of control, showing you both the infinite possibilities of the FBC and displaying the overwhelming sense of dread you have exploring its halls. Admittedly a concept almost copy-pasted from SCP's Candle Cove, but seeing the particular idea brought to life by Remedy is a dream come true. The actors' delivery of their lines is always just a little off. The puppets themselves are nightmarish in appearance, and the scripts are both insane and far darker than any show for children should ever be. I've recently become enamored by both lost media searches and analog horror, and I find that Threshold Kids works as something that could easily fit into either of those categories, and was no doubt brought about as a love for both. These two concepts work hand in hand, as much of the purpose of analog horror is to create an atmosphere, something that could be, and blend that with horror just outside reality. And so, the search for lost media unearthing things like Peppermint Park that actually were made with all the sensibilities of Threshold Kids fuels the plausibility of analog horror, and the two go on feeding the frenzy for each other. I've mentioned the game's various text logs throughout this critique, and they really are both vital to creating the world of Control and highly entertaining. They start quite strong on both of these fronts with the first log the player encounters reading. Reminder: certain objects are not allowed inside the Bureau. Recent incidents have necessitated an issued reminder on prohibited materials. Unauthorized weapons, pagers, laptops, smartwatches, smartphones, smart gaming devices, anything smart. Number 2 pencils, any objects considered iconic representations of archetypal concepts, e.g. rubber ducks and ketchup bottles. All material under Bureau investigation is to be brought through the private entrances. If you see any lobby personnel in breach of these policies, please notify your supervisor immediately. Now, be honest. After finding something like this, who could resist the urge to read the next, and the next, and the next? Almost every log has this level of flavor and spellbinding writing, which is tightly interwoven with incredibly smart world building. Whether it's introducing a new concept, expanding on the circumstances of an altered item, or providing depth and texture to the characters of Control, each of them is written to be utterly engrossing. I do think that the Dead Letters section deserve their own special mention for just how hilarious each one of them is. These are letters from the public that have gotten lost in the postal system and delivered to the FBC on the off chance that by the rule of synchronicity they are clues to altered items. It isn't terribly surprising that I find these so appealing, as they have a very similar feeling to the Threshold Kids, providing an amusing comic diversion while also hinting at greater darkness in the world. And I mean, we all know, planes aren't real. Dear New York Tribune, airplanes aren't real. I figured out how they do it. Their windows are TV screens. The whole thing moves on big tracks like a roller coaster that moves through underground tunnels in the earth. Airports are more like train stations. They do this because the sky is full of monsters that they don't want us to know about. The planes we see in the sky are the monsters. The government made Earth trains look like the monsters so they can lie to us better. Don't contact me. If the oldest house is a junction of dreams, then the war of Jesse against the Ace is a war of dreamers. Jesse came to the oldest house to find her brother Dylan. Dylan was taken by the Bureau long ago after an encounter with an object of power left them both without parents and blessed by an extraplanar entity which Jesse has named Polaris. And it is that Polaris that has guided her here now. This event left both Jesse and Dylan with a glimpse of the world beyond their own, and it is how they came to know they are but prisoners in a world of shadows. For Jessie, this would turn into a lifelong search for both her brother and another glimpse behind the poster. Dylan would not be so lucky, as just as he would be burdened with the knowledge of the truth, he would be denied any ability to see beyond the bounds of a cage more literal. Imprisoned by the FBC just like another altered item, it is only natural that he would take the role of prisoner and long desperately for escape. And it is so that when another tendril lashes into his cage, he is willing to take it, no matter from whence it issues. These, then, are the avatars of the Dreamers. Dylan, champion of the Hiss, and Jesse, most beloved by Polaris. Both of these forces wish to uplift and enlighten those they touch. Shine the harsh light of truth onto those living in a world of ignorance. But what truth means to Polaris and the Hiss is very, very different. For the Hiss, this is a complete dissolving of the self into comforting nothingness. The Hiss repeat an endless chant in unison, never-ending strings of calculated nonsense. Dylan reflects this, saying how wonderful it feels to say these words, and the former director Trent was like Dylan, touched and enamored by the resonance of the Hiss. Dylan and the Hiss, when confronted about the world beyond their dreams, fall into the comfort of madness and nihilism. If nothing matters, then the world can be a poster, a jail, or nothing at all. If the world is a disgusting mockery of what it should be, better to give up and say it never mattered in the first place. In the Alan Wake expansion, Wake says he wrote the Hiss into existence, including writing their chant, a Dadaist poem. Dadaism is a philosophy that rejects reason, or that the world ought to be defined by it, and that is exactly what the Hiss believe. Polaris, on the other hand, is a bastion of reason, rational thought, and individualism. She believes and grants to those she can the protection of all that matters to her. Polaris is a name well chosen by Jesse. So well chosen, one must wonder if she wasn't shepherded to it. Either way, Polaris takes the role of a guiding force. Not possessive or domineering as the Hiss, she subtly prods those who would listen to her resonance to freedom and individuality, but also to her own ends and desires. This does make her presence and willingness to help the FBC somewhat bewildering. The Federal Bureau of Control does exactly what it says: control. If anything, they ought in many respects to be more aligned with the Hiss, with their rampant desire to take and unify under their one hive mind. Both Dylan and Trent say that Polaris is a dangerous force, and the Hiss only doing what is necessary to combat her. Especially coming from Trent, who sought to tighten his fist around everything he could to control it, must seem reasonable to fight against one who would drive for freedom. Maybe even the freedom of those wild and dangerous machinations of the mind, altered items. It ought come as no surprise that despite the Hiss's best efforts, Jessie is able to push them back by destroying their portal into this realm and cleansing her brother of their influence. But this is hardly the end of her story, and she has now come into her role as director and survived her first crisis. For a moment now, however brief, she can breathe and try to figure out what her role as director means. Control can at times feel messy because it is the story of everything, an attempt to explore what underpins a whole world. Jessie's journey really does feel ancillary to the many log shows and stories told aside her, and it is this that makes Control both bewildering and enchanting. I often do not care for exploring and doing side quests in open world games because they too often feel like busy work. But here, I felt compelled to search down every bit of lore and hidden altered item that I could because there was so much joy in learning more. Control created a new frontier, a universe where everything feels new and full of mystery. There's a feeling I had when I first played 3D games that behind the next hill could be anything, that there was unlimited possibility to be found in every world. Control reignited that feeling in me and drove me down one brutalist corridor after another, chasing the next episode of Threshold Kids, the next log or enigmatic item to contain. The gameplay of Control is acceptable. The world of Control is unparalleled. But Jesse's story hardly ends at the banishing of the Hiss. 2 DLCs were released alongside Control, and the first follows Jesse at the very foundation of the oldest house, and the board are threatened there. The Foundation takes time to slow down and explore Jesse's new relation to the board since she has shown herself worthy of their appointment. As such, they trust her to resolve the remnants of the Hiss attempting to take control of their anchor to the oldest house, which they call the Nail. In order to explore the Foundation and solve the board's problem, they grant Jessie half of the powers she needs, unrealistically expecting her to solve their ills all the same. It is this that forces Jessie to turn to an outcast member of the board, an entity known only as the Former. And while this is an interesting, if inconclusive tidbit of lore, it more importantly represents Jessie beginning to accept her authority as director and confidence to be more than just a puppet of the board. While the board is initially contemptuous of her decision, they petulantly acquiesce and say that they have decided in retrospect she should have both tools she needs to solve their problem anyways. This bit of antagonism shows they might not have exactly the power over Jessie they implied, and gives her the opportunity to realize that she needs to take a more active role in running the Bureau if she really wants to make it into something that serves her purposes. This all acts as some well-needed and welcome development of Jessie, giving greater context to her action and providing a novel framework for her should there ever be a continued narrative. This framework also allows for much of the similar exploration and altered item containment afforded by the main game, and the Foundation contains probably what is the best altered item containment across the entire runtime of Control. The item in question does not have as interesting a containment procedure as the Mirror in terms of required player knowledge, but it does showcase Remedy's ability to craft amazing set pieces meaningfully connected to their world one last time. The camera must contain the spirit of an over-enthusiastic theater student because it refuses to do anything unless it is done with the utmost dramaticism. The frame grows narrow. The lights grow harsher. A pumping action track starts and Jessie feels compelled to yell a cliched, "After him!" and step on it to a non-existent drive. The throaty pumping bass intensifies as a life-or-death chase after the altered item escalates one threat after another, until enters, insert name of third act villain here, to bring the ride to its dramatic heights. And with its imagined narrative surge, the camera accepts its fate, returning to mundane containment. End Jessie in swift flight. The story of this item, built in the head of the player through nothing more than experiencing its containment, is brilliant. It allows you the opportunity to intuitively understand what the camera wants and how it operates without a single word being spoken in explanation. Remedy showcases in the camera containment their ability to tell stories with only gameplay, a feat accomplished only too infrequently in an inherently interactive medium. This, along with the fact that there is an episode of the Threshold Kids hidden in the Foundation, really does make this feel every bit act as much a continuation of the quality presented within Control's base game. You can step into this after banishing the hiss and not even know this was a project made on a smaller scale and budget. It keeps the core strengths of Control alive. The belief that every corner of the oldest house's foundation holds wonders beyond imagination. It is a bold decision to make the final DLC of Control integrally connected to the story of a game that came out 11 years ago, but that is exactly what the Alan Wake expansion aims to be. I do think the placement of this DLC as the last in the series is how to make such a move, as based off of things like achievement stats, only a handful of diehards usually stay around to even finish a game, let alone actually play its DLCs. So it's not an unreasonable expectation that many of the people who would want to play the last DLC of Control are longtime Remedy enthusiasts, or at least people with a passing familiarity of their works. I fully went into the DLC of Control expecting little from the Foundation and much from AWE. And when I found the Foundation to blow me away so effectively, my expectations for the AWE only ballooned. Unfortunately, it did not exactly deliver on even my original hopes. Beginning promising enough, AWE plays out an interaction between Alan and his progenitor, Thomas Zane, teasing the audience by dressing them both up in identical outfits. But the tantalizing scene ends before it even begins, and if you were hoping for more, I have some bad news. That's the last we'll see of those two for the rest of the DLC. The story, so predicated upon being the Alan Wake expansion, features him almost not at all. And if you were hoping for some cameos from any other notable figure like Alice, Barry, or even Sheriff Breaker, you will be sorely disappointed. Unless, of course, you were dying to know what happened to the shadow-consumed Hartman. That's right, this DLC is about chasing down Shadow Hartman, his form twisted even more by his exposure to the hiss and an admittedly well-designed monstrosity. Many times I was actually pretty spooked by his distended form popping out of nowhere, but that hardly saves this DLC from being a tedious slog almost entirely devoid of intrigue or really any plot at all. Hartman receives no characterization, and the aesthetic of areas you chase him through rarely vary from the standard Control fare. There are no meaningful advancements of the plot of Wake. Even the logs you find are mostly entirely tangential to Wake and spend quite a bit more time expanding on items and AWEs that, while interesting and up to the standards set by the main game, do not meaningfully pay off the promise of an expansion called the Alan Wake expansion. Even at that, the altered items you contain here are not up to the incredibly high standards set by the Foundation's camera chase, and there's no Threshold Kid episodes. I know that last complaint must sound awful petty and personal, but Threshold Kids are a pretty major reward for exploration in my mind. Leaving them out of this expansion only makes it feel all the more hollow and cheap. After chasing down Hartman 4 times, the DLC ends with a teaser for Alan Wake 2. After this grueling and repetitive chase through long, nondescript corridors, you are finally rewarded with a message that has all the impact of Christmas stories, drink your Ovaltine. It inevitably feels like a bit of a bait and switch. The expansion garnering not an insubstantial amount of hype on the back of being the first meaningful piece of Wake storytelling since 2012, only to be a $10 advertisement for a game that may or may not ever exist. I do feel the need to add a small amount of pessimism here, as it is not the first time that a Wake sequel has been teased only for Remedy to fail to deliver. Quite frankly, I will believe that there is actually a new Wake game when I have it in my hands. At least I don't feel bad about not including this in my Alan Wake retrospective, as the only worthwhile thing this does for the series is decanonize Alan Wake's American Nightmare. The unanswered mystery is what stays with you in the end, is a lesson well learned by Remedy from their experience with Alan Wake, and very little is ever given concrete explanation in Control. We are left only to wonder and speculate at the numerous plot threads. Trying to understand Control is like trying to interpret a dream. Its meaning opaque even to the dreamer, the best we can do is guess at its purpose if it has one at all. I admittedly had a lot of difficulty writing about Control because it is both incredibly deep and vast with numerous stories and narratives, but seemingly shallow with its tale that defies conclusive interpretation. Like being in a dream, the best I can do is describe its feeling, understand its context, and hope to grab at more concrete ideas as they pass by. But just as a dream shifts, so does the world of the oldest house. Loathing conclusion, loathing definitive interpretation, it spins and wheels and attempts to comprehend it. In the end, like the bureau, all I can do is contain it, put it in a place and point to its location, safe, sound, and secure. Maybe one day it will spill forth answers, but all I can do for now is watch. So, with my dissection of Control completed, I have also finished playing and critiquing Remedy's entire catalog from Max Payne onward. And the big question is, was it worth it? I would have to say I believe so. Playing every Remedy game back to back and turning a critical eye to them really made evident to me numerous strong narrative through lines. While no doubt many of the people working at Remedy change from game to game, with the exception of Quantum Break, every Remedy game feels distinctly like they pick up where the themes of the last game left off. All the way from when Max Payne became Alan Wake, it felt like Wake took the torch of Payne and delved into the themes and ideas it was unable to. I feel Remedy games have never received quite the accolades of their peers for their nature as genre pieces, but I believe this has only worked to serve them. They have used the tropes and ideas of those fictions to craft something entirely their own, and incorporated this with their unparalleled scene-building expertise to craft unforgettable moments and set pieces that immerse you in their environments completely. If there's one thing I think I've really learned from all this, it's why I love Remedy's games. And that is that they each do their best to immerse you in the world of their protagonists through gameplay. It's never been enough for Remedy to tell a story at you. It really feels like they're doing their best to tell a story with you. Each game has incorporated unique mechanics in an attempt to make you feel the role of protagonist. Not a generic set of tools seen in other games and included without thought, each capability afforded the player is purposeful. Whether it was slow-mo, flashlights, time manipulation, or the vast ocean of the human mind, each game prods you to become, for just a little while, a star in their leading role. Thank you for watching.